Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dr. Basil Considine. I am here from the ACU Online Writing Center, and we are here for preparing a journal article for publication. Now, this is a webinar that people usually come with one of two things on their mind. Either they have some research that they're working on that they think, I'd like this to have a larger life when I'm done working on it, or they've already finished their research and are thinking, I'd like other people to read it. And sometimes that comes with a particular interest where you just want to share your information with your colleagues. Sometimes it's something where your workplace gives you a reward for this, whether this is consideration when it comes to promotions or consideration when it comes to raises. I worked for one university that would just give us each a $500 check when we had an article published. And that was all very nice. So whatever your reasons, please tell us some more about why you are here. Now, we do have another webinar coming in at 7 o'clock, Introduction to the Writing Center. So if you are waiting for that, don't worry, it's the exact same URL for that, just you'll want to come back in an hour for that. But right now, this is preparing a journal article for publication. And all right, with no further ado, we're going to dive in. So coming up on our schedule, as I mentioned, we have our Introduction to the Writing Center webinar coming up at 7 o'clock today, same place. If you're here for both, awesome. Just stay here and we'll continue on over. We have our Doctoral Writing as a Nurse Tips for DNP Students webinar on Sunday, followed by Introduction to Graduate Writing in APA Style. And I will say that a lot of journals have made their switch to APA 7th edition just in this last month. So if you are one of our current students and you have just realized that you have to write an APA 7th edition next term, it's a great one to come, get a quick refresher, as well as a crash course in what APA 7 looks like. And we have our dedicated Intro to APA 7th edition webinar on Tuesday at 6 p.m. These webinars are, of course, recorded, as are all of our webinars by default. So if you can't make it in real time, you're more than welcome to go to our website later and grab the recording there. We also post a copy of the slide deck if you're interested. So if you have to duck out from today's session and you miss something, don't worry, you can always catch it on the recording. So we are going to start by looking at how to select a target journal first. Now, a target journal is not necessarily the journal where something is ultimately published, but it is a journal that you select and you say, I am going to write for this kind of audience with these kinds of considerations. Why? Well, because if you're knowing who you're writing for, you can know who you need to include information details for and what kinds of things you can leave out. If you're writing for a more general audience of people working in medical profession, there might be a lot of stuff that you spell out because you can't be sure that they went to nursing school, say. On the other hand, if you are writing for an audience of nurses, you probably do not need to indicate some basic details about anatomy that other audience might require. And similarly, you get to pick whether this target journal has things like requiring minimal reworking from you. Now, I mentioned that a lot of journals have just made their transition over from requiring APA 6th edition to APA 7th edition this spring. And so if you're working and your dissertation or your doctoral study will be an APA 7th edition, it can be a big time saver to find a journal that requires exactly what you were using. I'm not saying you can't do it. I had a book chapter that the first publisher was bought out, and then the second one was bought out. And each time, as it was bought out, they said, oh, yes, we want to publish your book, but it needs to be in this style system. And so we switched it over. Did it take forever? No, it probably took me an extra hour, hour and a half each time because I had to go and change some stuff that was customized just for that system. So not a ton of time, but there are lots of things that you could do with an extra hour or two. You also want one that has an acceptably short turnaround time. Now, a couple times in this presentation, I'm going to be jumping back and forth to show you things from different websites, because this mirrors the kind of research that you might do for your own. So because as there are some things that can occasionally happen where the sharing doesn't kick in right away, please let me know if you can't see what I'm talking about. So you should now see my sharing my web browser where I have the submission guidelines for the Journal of Continuing Education in Nursing. This is a popular one for students in our DNP program to publish in because a lot of them work on projects that are about continuing education in nursing. So this is a natural audience. And you'll see that this one very helpfully tells us at the top here, oh, it's a well-established journal, been going for more than 50 years. It has a high impact factor. If you're wondering what that is, it's mainly something you'd be concerned about if you are working at a research-intensive university in R3 and R2 and R1. And let me know if you want me to explain what that is. But basically, if you're working at a research-intensive university, probably your promotion and tenure process would involve your having to publish at least a couple articles in so-called high-impact journals. And the high impact is measured by how much articles in these journals get cited in other articles. So impact factor of 0.925 is pretty good. That means it's being cited a fair bit. And we see here the piece of information that brought us here. Average time from submission to decision, 42 days. That's pretty good. I've seen a lot where it's upwards of 200 days and a couple journals where it's over a year. And those ones you probably don't want to publish in because any benefits that you get from having that article published are probably sooner rather than later kind of things. So if you see one that has a time from submission to decision under 30 days, that's exceptional. Anything in the 1 to 2 month range, I find a great turnaround time. Among other things, because it's more likely to be corrected honest. The ones that have an average time of less than a month, there's a lot where someone gets busy, it's final season or something that can slow down that response. So we're going to head back to our slide deck now. Now, acceptably short turnaround time, this is subjective. If it's not something where your job requires or directly rewards you for something, you might be willing to wait a little bit longer for a journal that you really like. Perhaps it's one that you read a lot or your colleagues read and you say, you know, I want to be part of this pool, which is totally legitimate. If you have some milestone where perhaps you're looking to have it on your resume or your CV for an upcoming job application, then you probably want a shorter turnaround time. And I will say that if your article is accepted for publication, even if it's accepted with a request for revisions, you can still put it on your CV. You'll just mark it as forthcoming whatever issue or accepted by such and such a journal. You also want to find a journal that has an audience that's interested in the things that you are writing about and publishes things that interest you. Why? Well, first of all, there'll be more synergy between what you're already working on and what they're looking for and fewer changes required. And also because we spend a fair amount of time working on these. And if it's not something that excites you at the beginning, it's probably not going to get better. If it's a journal that publishes things that interest you, you're probably already reading it and probably already thinking, you know, this is the kind of stuff I like. They see things or they put things the way that I'm interested in, and that's a net win. So how to select it? Well, you want a journal that uses and leverages what you already know. This is one of the reasons why a lot of people, their first article is taking material that they worked on for their dissertation or their doctoral study and adapting or expanding that. You want it to meet some sort of professional requirement or goal that you have, something that has you saying, yes, I do want to finish that. Now, you can always come back to and expand it later, but you want to finish it so you can say, okay, this article is done and plays to your interest. Now we're going to pop back to that web page we were looking at earlier, and I'm going to show you a particular detail here about we're looking for length guidelines. Now, this particular journal says manuscripts can range from 6 to 15 pages in length including references, figures, and tables. This is a good thing to look at early, because if you have research and you say, oh yeah, 15 pages, I can totally do that, that's great. If you say, well, 15 pages, I've got 60, how am I going to cut that down? Perhaps you want to find a journal where what they're looking for is more close to the size that you have in mind right now. It's usually easier to cut than to add, but 60 to 15 to 15 is a whole different order than going from 20 to 15, say. And I think most people agree that it's easier to do the short, concise article as a start. And from there, wherever you want to go, sky's the limit. Back to the slides now. So I like to ask the question, what are you already reading? And I encourage you to share in the chat room if there are any choices that you would like to share with the group. I can tell you that from the programs that we have here, for example, students in the EDD program, the Doctorate of Education, often are citing works from journals like Educational Leadership, the Journal of Higher Education, the Journal of Higher Education Leadership, and because they're so familiar with these, end up using these as their target journals when they're writing it. Does it end up being where they ultimately publish? Sometimes, sometimes not. Sometimes they look at it and say, okay, well, I really like this journal, but their turnaround time is 6 months. And here's another one that's very similar in style, and their turnaround time is about 2 months. I would like to do that one. So as you might guess, one of the great ways to start is to just look at your reference list and see, what are you citing? Are there some themes where you see that something is appearing a lot? And I see someone in the group has said that they are working on loci of control associated with first-year student retention. Great. So one of the things to keep in mind is, where would you want the research you're working on to go later? Now, of course, if you're working in college student retention, and please correct me if this is not about higher education and it's about, say, high school retention, naturally it's easy to think, oh, well, one of the main journals for that, the journal that has this all in the name, is the Journal of College Student Retention. So in fact, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pull up that journal website. And I'm going to share that here. You should now be seeing the website for the Journal of College Student Retention. And if you're wondering how I found that, I just literally Googled the name Journal of College Student Retention, and it was the first result. So we come here to the journal homepage, and we see, all right, we can browse the journal, look and see table of contents, what's the most recent stuff that they published. And although we'd have to go in through the ACU library catalog to download these, you can access all of these through ACU. See, okay, just looking at this, all right, this piece is 21 pages. This piece here is 27. This one here is 9. This one here is 14. Okay, getting some idea of the ranges here. But right up here, you see that there's a submit paper button. So if you have some research, and some people even do modify papers that they're working on, often the final term paper for a class, as that they end up getting published before they finish their dissertation, is you might want to go here and see, do you have something that you feel that stands on its own? And if you've been working on your assignments and you're a couple semesters in, chances are you have worked on a couple things that might be of interest, because there are journals that publish annotated bibliographies. There are annotated bibliography assignments in both of our doctoral programs. There are ones that publish case studies on research and on leadership. And we have assignments in EDD that involve writing a case study about your own experiences and observations of leadership. So it is certainly very possible to publish research that you are working on for your courses. Now we'll see on this journal website that this journal, and let me just make sure that you are seeing my screen here. Yeah, you should be seeing the journal website here. We see that they're already using APA 7th edition. Great. You just submit your file in Microsoft Word format. All right. And there is no formal page length limit, but they say most manuscripts fall between 16 to 36 pages, counting everything. And that's good to know. They're also using footnotes in addition to APA references. And that's fine. Depending on your audience, you might want to include some explanatory notes that in, core APA writing you minimize, but for this journal, they have the opportunity to give recommendations and explanations that would otherwise slow down the text. So that's all fine. And let's see what other details they have here. Well, journal submission is pretty simple. Let's see if they say anything about their turnaround time. They do not. And what I would recommend and doing, if you see that you're interested in a journal, but they don't happen to list that, I would recommend finding who the editor is. And we see, oh, their email is right here at the bottom of the page, and sending them an email saying, hi, I am considering submitting an article. Could you please tell me what the time range is for your initial review process? And that's usually something that the editor can respond fairly quickly. So if you're wondering, does this come up a lot? Actually, yes. In a previous university job, we had a number of professors who were coming up for tenure. And so to be promoted and to have essentially switched to a permanent contract, they needed to have an article in a certain amount of time. And so I sat down with them, looked at it, and we found some journals that matched up what they're doing. And they wrote, the editors found one that had good turnaround time that met all their other requirements. And 2 months later, the article was published online. It had been accepted 4 weeks in. There was a couple rounds of turnaround with feedback with the editor, and then they published in advance online. So he had a DOI and everything, and it went into his tenure file, and he got tenure. So if that kind of thing is important to you, or you think it might be, this kind of research process can be very helpful. Also, if anyone's ever said, I think this group or this kind of people would be interested in reading it, that's a good clue for where you might be steering. I am a member of a couple professional societies that have regular calls for papers and calls for proposals. You'll often see the call for proposals or a call for book chapters for edited volumes, which are a fine thing. I've published a couple things that are in book chapters. But if that particular have an article in a peer review journal is something that's important to you, do make sure that you're looking at exactly that. A call for proposal for a journal is usually for a special issue where they're looking and seeing, can we get a bunch of things on this topic? I once had a group of students in the same leadership class who ended up publishing all their final papers in their own special issue that they crafted, where they proposed a special issue to the journal. There are usually instructions for how to do that on the journal website. Put out a call for proposals, and it was pretty much 7 students in that class and one other person who responded to the call, and they had a special issue of the journal that was all of their research for that class. Another key difference between the two is that usually a call for papers requires that you submit a complete draft, whereas a call for proposals, you can send an abstract or summary of the proposed piece. And I've had this come up for research that I've done. I have the article that I submitted to the American Harp Journal, and their process is they want to see a proposal for a journal article first, which is essentially send them the abstract, and then they'll write back and say either, oh, great, we would like to do this, please send us a full article, or they'll say, with our readership, but it would be great if you could say a little bit more about these aspects. Is this something you can do? You can? Great. Or if it doesn't work out, you might be better suited going to this other place because we think our readers are less interested in that, which is fine because usually they give really good recommendations about where you should go. Now, if you have a printed journal, which is becoming less common these days, you can look in the front or back cover, but all these journals should now have their guidelines online, as I've showed you with those earlier examples. Here are a couple links that you could follow to look at those for the Journal of Professional Nursing and for the Journal Educational Leadership, both of which are what we call greatest hits in a lot of our students' reference lists. Do check for those special themed issues because often it's something where you're working on your research because you think it's important. And if you find a special or themed issue for other people who also think that's important, it's kind of nice to be in that company. And sometimes you'll have this rare opportunity to cross-reference other articles that are in that same special issue. So it's really come here and find the latest, greatest, including these connections. I once had stuff in a special issue where there was some stuff that I had been looking for that someone else had found. And so I was able to add a note saying, oh, see this article, these pages. And readers had to just turn to that and find it, which was great. Some points of etiquette. Don't submit an article to more than one journal at the same time. Now, if it's rejected and then you want to go submit somewhere else, that's perfectly fine. But just like you don't want to have more than one outstanding marriage proposal to different people at the same time, it's better to not end up in the position where two journals say, we'd love to publish your article, and you have to tell one, oh, yeah, sorry, no thanks. Decided to go with the better offer. That's just not polite. And so you want to only submit to one article, submit an article to one journal at a time. But as soon as they say no, you can go somewhere else. But often if you get the no, it comes with suggestions for how to match things up. Either matching it up with an audience or another journal that's more appropriate, or there are things that they would like to see to make it a good fit for them that if you can reasonably change, you might just end up revising and resubmitting. And this is another thing where that turnaround time may be very important to you. If you waited for 6 months for a response for them, some people say, well, okay, I've waited long enough. I'm going to a journal with a short turnaround time, and I'm still going to use these suggestions, but I'm just going to that other one. And yeah, that happens. And other people take well, this is where I really want it to be, so I'm going to revise and submit. It's a question of personal preference there. All right, rejection reasons. Well, the most common reasons that I've been told by editors are either because it's a mismatch between what the editor thinks the journal audience is and what the article is doing, or that there's a quality assurance issue. Now, quality assurance is not saying the material has to be perfect, but if it looks like you haven't done your due diligence, like you haven't run your document through spell check and done basic proofreading, that doesn't help. They might say, well, when you've done that, come back to us. But in the meantime, we're not going to spend any more time on it. Sure. And sometimes it's also due to an issue of audience saturation. Have they published something like this very recently? Or do they have an issue that's about to come out that is a lot of stuff about this? And if that's happening, then often it is better to go to another journal because they've already reached their saturation point for the year or for the issue. It is helpful to keep in mind that peer review comments are designed to be helpful, even if they don't always feel that way, and that they do give you a step-by-step list of concerns to address. Most articles go through 2 to 3 rounds of peer review and revisions before publication. I had an article that was published last fall in Maryland Historical Magazine. It went through 2 formal rounds of peer review and a lot of back and forth with the editor where she would say things like, I'd like to have some more detail about that. And, oh, well, since you mentioned that very interesting thing, can you expand on that one? And so it did grow a bit. But in that case, the whole article was published less than 6 months after I submitted the first draft. And we're just revising it every couple of weeks. We'd have another round of back and forth. And it was a much better article because of that. Takeaway. Well, if you know why your manuscript was returned to you, why it wasn't accepted or wasn't accepted immediately, that tells you what you need to know to either revise it for the target journal or to go find a more suitable target journal to prepare it for. This is the instance that I referred you to earlier, where I had an article published this fall. If you'd like to see these guidelines, well, we can bring them up here. This is a humanities journal. It caters to what we call a generalized audience. There's some people who read this who are just fans of history. They want to know something about the place that they live or lived. And there are also people who are university professors, there are amateur historians, professional genealogists, many different people reading this. So there is a lot of exposition and explanation that you might not get in, say, a 19th century history journal. So it can be anything from colonial times up to the present. There is probably going to be a COVID-19 related issue coming in a couple years. This is both a wonderful thing because I can go through Maryland now and some people will say, Basil, did you write the article on this? I was like, why, yes, I did. Pleased to meet you. Glad you read it. And that's rather lovely. I do a lot of research out there for various things. And even though there are only about 3,000 print subscribers because they publish online, there's actually a much higher readership. And so I've met professors and students and such like that who have read the research, which always makes me happy. So we have their contributor guidelines. And we'll see that they talk a bit about how this is a match. And that they do require that, as I mentioned, that this not be under consideration for publication by another journal. This original scholarship and have not previously been published part, do you want to keep this in mind? Now, something that you wrote as a course paper, okay, that's fine. That's not considered a formal publication. If you had, half of the text that was in another journal already, then that would probably be a red flag for them. Now, it could be ground that you've covered already, but you've expanded it and significantly rewritten it. But still, you would want to be upfront about that to make sure that there's no confusion later about, but wait, what about this other thing that you wrote? All right, back to the slides. So in this case, I started writing my article in January 2019, submitted it in March. August 2019, I got the peer-reviewed feedback. They did have an editor change in the middle there. So it wasn't anyone's fault that it sat for a little while. And then I got my revisions back to them a month later. That should now say published. It was published in the fall issue. So when they got back to me in September 2019 about the revisions, they said, we think this is going to be right at the end of the year. And as it happened, someone else who was working on their article wasn't quite as fast. So they moved my article up by 1 issue. And so it got published a little bit sooner than I thought it was, which No one's complaining about that. So let's talk a little bit about that plan I mentioned earlier about how to create a manageable article of reasonable scope. And I say reasonable because we all have things we want to do in life, and there are lots of things that are easier if we finish some projects and move on to the next thing. So what do the submission guidelines say about length, whether that's in number of words or number of pages? And what do the recently published articles suggest about preferred length, like, again, counted in words or pages? And one of those journal submission guideline pages we looked at earlier, we saw that they said that most articles were in that 15 to 25 page range. But when we looked at the table of contents for the same journal, their most recent issue had one article that was 9 pages in length. So keep in mind that the recently published, it may tell you slightly different things than the submission guidelines, because these are, again, guidelines and not necessarily ironclad requirements that it must be X length. And a piece might shrink in the editing process, it might grow in the editing process, you might add more things in the revision that they wanted to see, so they say even if it goes slightly longer, that's still acceptable. Now, once you find the length for the journal that you have in mind, once you've got your target journal thing, look and see with the material that you have on hand, whether that's research or written out text, can you reasonably trim or expand it to fit within their required or preferred length? And if not, can you adapt the scope to become a standalone article? That article that I had published in Maryland Historical Magazine is an extract of research that I'm working on for my book. It is something where I said, okay, clearly the book is going to be much longer than I could publish in this, but I can take this one aspect, in this case, these were letters exchanged by the Marquis de Lafayette and a lady from Baltimore, and I can write a great focused article about this. And also, that means when I'm working on the book, I can cite the article and then not have to explain absolutely everything in the book. So that was, to me, a real win, because I could just focus on this one concise aspect, get a decent article, and turn around that in time for me to have it on my CV for the next grant that I was applying for, which was very helpful, mind you, because I got that next grant. So planning. Well, if you've been working on some long form writing and coming to our webinars, some of this may seem familiar. First step, either write out an outline for a new writing project, or if you're reworking material you already have, create a reverse outline. A reverse outline being when you go in and you mark and say, okay, so these paragraphs are on this theme and these paragraphs are on this theme. This is my main point. This is my main point. This is my introduction. That's my conclusion. Where you go in and you apply the same kind of labels you'd have when you're writing out your outline, but you're doing it with your draft. And with this, you can look and check what you've noted against the target journal and make sure that you have all the ingredients that they say they need. If they say they want clearly stated research questions, you should have something that's clearly labeled as a research question. If they say, I want a research methods section for submissions, you should have a section that's labeled research methods. If you have one that does that, but it's called research design, rename it to research methods if research methods is what they're asking for. That kind of thing may seem purely cosmetic, but it really makes the journal editor's job easier, because they can see, oh, yes, they do have that part. They do have that section. Check, check, check. When you get peer review comments, and you will always get peer review comments, they will generally make it work longer. Don't worry about that. The ones that are easiest to answer are those that say, give me a citation for this, or give me more citation, or just change this. As I would recommend when you are working with your committee and they say, change this wording to that, just change the wording to that, unless there's a real issue. Most of the time, it's about aligning it to the audience and whether it's a professor on your committee or a peer reviewer or the editor or the journal is saying, you know, this is the way we put things for our readers, and you just take that advice and make the change. The ones that are hardest and usually most time consuming are a directive to add content. Now, it might be you have that content lying around because you cut it earlier for length and you just put it back in. Great. If it's something where they say, well, why aren't you citing these things in this field, or why don't you talk about this aspect or this subset of literature? Again, go look and see what you had in your original draft and notes first to see if you can add that in directly from that. But if you have to write an all new section or new paragraphs, that usually takes longer. I like to start with just take care of the add citations and the basic copy editing, corrections, rephrasing things first, because then you get that sense of progress. And then anything that requires more substantial rewriting or adding content, you want to look at it and say, okay, are there connections for here that will be changed by this as well that I might need to take into consideration, and perhaps some other things will get moved around. Again, it's much faster than writing the draft you submit in the first place, but it does take more time. Often there'll be a little bit of extra research. In my case, there were things that the editor said, you know, our reader wants to know, is this such and such a famous person that I've heard about in school? Can you add more stuff about that? So there are lots more explanatory notes added for those people because that's a big part of their readership. Some sample comments. So this is one of the peer review comments in the right-hand margin. Given this observation, what percentage of Lafayette's correspondents were women? Is it possible to make any generalizations about the women with whom he exchanged letters? And what I did with that is I said, okay, well, no one's made a complete accounting of Lafayette's correspondence, but I have a book here that was published in the 1970s that lists every single letter that the editor knew about that was in the United States. And I can go through that, and I can count up all the women's names there and give some numbers. How long did that take me? About 15 minutes. Did that satisfy the peer reviewer's concern? Yep. Was I able to make any generalizations about the women with whom we exchanged letters? Yes, as a matter of fact, I was able to say, well, I went through and I counted them all, and because there was a list of all the letters for each one after their name, I was able to say, well, she's in the top 3 list of women that he wrote the most in this period. So that they're asking me to supply some information allowed me to add the specific fact that I didn't even know when I started it because they asked that question. And then here we have some notes from the editor where she put some stuff at the bottom with some specific directives, as well as some other peer review comments at the top of the page. So there were 2 peer reviewers for the first round. The first one put their comments in marginal comments in Word, and the second one just wrote essentially a list of musings about that. And so I had all those marginal comments, which were basically directives, as where I'd go and answer them one by one. And with this set of feedback was more of a, okay, make sure that I've answered these across the whole arc of it. And some of it was going through and clarifying some language or adding an additional explanation. And some of it was adding stuff. But just as the other one, I need to keep track that I was doing each of these. And if you're curious, I would either go and add a marginal comment responding to each one saying done, or in this case, I would cross them out using the cross-out tool in Word as I went to make sure that I'd taken care of all of them. Revisions. So you will usually get something called a Galley Proof. The name Galley Proof is a legacy of old metal printing plates where basically they'd run off a couple prints before they did the whole book run and circulate those galley proofs and say, hey, before we do the for real print run, are there any last minute changes that you want us to do? So this is the final revision stage before publication. This is where you really, really want to go through and make sure you've checked, after all those revisions, is there anything else that needs to be tweaked? Typos that have crept in, some spacing that's not right, something like that. When you get to the galley proof stage, you don't want to be inserting whole paragraphs and sections. But if you notice, oh, that word is really not right, or I misspelled someone's name, yeah, you can still get that. And in my case, this is the digital galley proof that they sent over. You'll see that there are those numbers there to indicate which line of text, and that they would refer to things like, oh, page 39, line 36. And it's pretty nice. We found a fair number of typos that had crept in. Some of them were my fault. Some of them were the editor's fault. Some of them were the printer's fault. But the important thing was that we found them and fixed them so that when this went into print, it was as good as it could be. Here's some examples of the galley proof comments that went back and forth. And you'll see that they're very much itemized, very directive, and so they were very fast to go through. And that concludes the main part of our presentation. So I know that we have people from at least 2 programs here because I recognize some of your names here. We have some time if you'd like us to look at a specific journal or to discuss specific examples. Again, I know that people come to this webinar either looking down the road or with something in hand. So while I let my colleague Julie prepare for the next webinar, if there are things that you'd like to ask about or hear about in more detail, just let me know and I'm happy to assist.